that we will see throughout the book, we were gently introduced to the theme of the book of Daniel, in that God gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. We're also told that Daniel, or we're introduced to the very character of the person of Daniel, in that he had unwavering devotion to his God. In chapter 2, we see that God lets mankind know, through a dream that he gives to Nebuchadnezzar, of his plan to save mankind through his kingdom. The theme again of God being in control is underlined. He is in control of kings and kingdoms, and he works through his providence and occasionally through his special working, using, sometimes we call that through miracles. He works through the fabric of mankind to bring about that kingdom and bring it into existence. And we learn when that's going to happen. We learn that it is during the period of the fourth kingdom that would come after that of Nebuchadnezzar, after Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. In chapter 3, we are reminded, or Nebuchadnezzar is reminded, and then again all of mankind is reminded, that God is the one God, that no other worship is acceptable unto God other than worshiping him, and the God of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which are known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are praised because they again will not bow down to idol worship, improper worship, that worship which is not acceptable to the God of heaven. And we might be reminded the very reason that the Jews are in captivity to begin with. So let's take just a moment and think about all of the things that would affect at this point in time. Nebuchadnezzar has made this big proclamation. This is early on in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. This is most likely before Ezekiel has been taken captive. There are some Jewish captives in the kingdom, as we know, because Daniel and other individuals have been taken captive. So there are Jewish captives in the kingdom. We know because Israel has been taken captive 175 years prior, that there are also Jews from that captivity in the kingdom. At some point, somewhere, who knows exactly where they were, because Assyria had spread them throughout the then known world, and some of them most likely were deposited into Babylon, that region that Syria then controlled. So let's think for just a moment how that might affect these individuals. All of the world was then told that the God of Daniel in chapter 2, and then in chapter 3, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that God should be praised. Do we think that that's had any effect? Well, as Ezekiel now is, as we find through the years, before we get to chapter 4, several years are going to take place of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Several years of his rule. And as Ezekiel begins to write, and if you take a look at Ezekiel's book, what do we find in Ezekiel? Ezekiel is able to move around throughout all the captives. He is able to move freely. He is able to teach and to talk to his fellow captives. So we find that in the captivity, at least they were able to move around. Now, how far they were able to move, were they able to move from one province to another without paperwork? I don't know. I cannot tell you. But I know that they weren't so enjoined that they could not at least move around and see each other. There does not seem to be such an oppression that we see that in the oppression that they had in Egypt. They were able to worship the way they wanted to. Isn't that part of Ezekiel's job as a prophet, to tell them, even though they find themselves in a foreign land, to not forget God? So they're able to worship as they want to. They're able to greet one another and teach one another. Isn't that part of Ezekiel's job, to be the watchman on the wall? To rebuke his brother if he finds him doing that which was wrong and not following the law of Moses? So we know certain things about it when we read the other prophets. We know something about their captivity. They were a free people. They were able to take care of themselves. And we also know that when we read something about those tablets and things that are dug up in the desert. Nebuchadnezzar was an individual that allowed his peoples to worship different gods. He believed in a pantheon of gods, and as we've already seen in the chapters what we have read, that most likely he accepted the Jewish God as one of the gods in his pantheon of gods. So he allowed the Jews to worship their God as they wanted to, most likely, without any kind of oppression. We see no evidence of them being oppressed as we see under the Persian Empire. Under the Persian Empire, there are letters written that they try to oppress the Jews, do they not? Under Esther, they try to wipe out one individual. Haman tries to wipe out the entire Jewish race, right? So there is oppression under certain empires. We know that. We see that. We have evidence of that. But under Nebuchadnezzar, there's no evidence of that. We don't see it. So they're allowed to, as far as we know, there's no major type of oppression, and they're allowed to worship.
I was just going to say, I think as it pertains to their day-to-day, I think we don't read of a high priest or going into the tabernacle or a temple or anything, so that part of worship obviously seems to have been suppressed because of the circumstance. I mean, they couldn't go to Jerusalem, and we don't read of a high priest making, during that time. So I guess
that's true. They were still captives. They were not allowed to go back home, and they were still captives. So there was a certain amount of restriction of movement, and how much restriction, that we don't know. Could they move? How much they could move within the empire? But and you're correct. They were still captives. And I'm not trying to say they weren't captives, but I'm saying in their captivity, there's no huge, there's no evidence of extreme oppression. They seem to be allowed to go about their day-to-day activities. As we read Ezekiel, they were able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and take care of normal day-to-day activities and worship, or at least pray to God and things of this nature, without any oppression or things of this nature into their lives. And I can't help but think that Daniel, being in the king's court, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael being in the king's court, and these things that's happened here, has something to do with it, has some effect upon the whole kingdom. They've shown themselves these things. Don't you think the king pulls Daniel aside and he wants to know a little bit more about the writings of the Jews? Now you you can interpret dreams and you are able to do these things. What are some of your sacred writings? I want to know about some of these things. This is not a dumb individual. This is a very sharp man. So I can't help but imagine, and we're going to see that there's a camaraderie, that's not the right word. There's some type of relationship between the king and Daniel that we will see in the next chapter that has developed over the years for some reason. And is it because Daniel was always good at his job? Okay, I don't know. Is it because the king trusts Daniel and he's a good advisor? You know that he was, but is that the reason? I don't know. But there is some type of relationship there, because Daniel expresses regret. It's a type of regret that he doesn't express in the following chapter towards the next king who doesn't act correctly as well. He doesn't have that kind of relationship. And so there is something about Nebuchadnezzar which is different. And so let's take a moment and look at some of the things about the Babylonian Empire, and we'll see that Nebuchadnezzar himself is a very special individual as far as some of the things he did. He was not a selfish man. We'll see his father, Nabopolassar. He is crowned king of Babylon in 625 BC with a coalition of individuals. We've talked about this before, but I'm going over it again. He takes and throws off the Assyrian yoke, and he takes the city of Nineveh. And so at that time, he begins rebuilding the city of Babylon. Now, there's a canal system that has been being built, and he enlarges that canal system. So the Babylonians have been building this canal system for some 150 years, and so they're using that canal system for their food, for growing food and things of this nature for some time now. But Nabopolassar enlarges it. Okay, now some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar has done, of course, we know about the first siege, which Daniel is taken hostage, and then some of the temple vessels are taken during that first siege. That's where we are introduced to Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel verse 2. He defeats Pharaoh Necho at Carmichash, which is actually not too terribly far from Nineveh. I had to look that up on the map. I thought it was down in Egypt, but it's actually not in Egypt. It's actually not far from the city of Nineveh. And by defeating him, he gains control of Western Asia. You have to understand that Pharaoh Necho, the Egyptian empire is falling off the zenith of its power at this point in time. So as he gains control of them and makes them a vassal state, he is now has a great deal of power. And of course, Egypt is and always has been the breadbasket of the world. They grow a great deal of food down there. So this is an important area for him to control. We have the second crusade against Jerusalem in 597. This is when Ezekiel is taken captive. And so if you see that period of time that after Daniel is taken captive, there's 2 or 3 chapters 2 and through 3 take place, and then 597 Ezekiel now is taking place. You can see things in the city of Babylon are set for these Jewish captives now to come in, live a peaceful life in their captivity, and if they are obedient. Now you can see that Nebuchadnezzar rules with a heavy hand. But as we've already noted, if you're obedient to him, if you'll follow him, he's okay. He seems to be a fairly good ruler. But if you don't, he didn't have much patience for people who don't follow his rules. So that's pretty much the way he goes. You follow my rules, I'll let you have I'll give you a lot of rope, but when you come to end that rope, there's a noose on the end of that rope, and he knows how to yank it hard. Okay? All right. Now, one of the things I want you to see, his building is as impressive as his conquest. He enlarges the canal systems that his father has started. He goes outside of the city. He makes those canal systems larger so that he can feed all the people. So you can see this is an individual that cares about the people that he governs. He's not a selfish individual. He's not just going out wanting wealth. He's not going out and just wanting power. He's trying to take care of the people that he has control over. All right? We talked about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Of course, now there's some question about whether or not those gardens were actually in Babylon or whether they were actually in Nineveh, but we'll let the historians figure that one out. You'll notice he enlarged his father's palace. He doubled the walls around the whole of Babylon. Here's a city by some people's estimate was 12 square miles. To have walls that were 40 foot thick, over 40 foot tall, at the top they were 20 foot wide, they could run 2 war chariots abreast down them. This is impressive. So you got one set of walls, and that wasn't enough for him to protect his people. He builds another set of walls on the outside of those. This city is near impregnable. This is a man that cared about the people that he wants to make certain nobody can breach the walls and hurt his people. Okay? He builds temples, he builds gardens, he paves the streets. Some say that Herodotus actually did walk down the streets of Babylon about 100 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Some people say he didn't actually walk down the streets. As I read Herodotus's history, he did sail down the Euphrates, so it's believable to think he actually was in the city about 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar. So whether he was in the city or not in the city, I won't get in that debate either.
It makes it even more impressive too because when you think of Syria and Iraq, you think of desert. And for him to have some of the most beautiful gardens, I mean, it shows the power of their irrigation systems
Yeah, and I'll eventually get there.
And they probably transplanted plants from other areas and brought them in.
This is the Ishtar Gate. Saddam Hussein recreated this Ishtar Gate from the city of Babylon. Babylon is about 45 miles south, I don't remember, southwest or southeast, but anyways, somewhere south of Baghdad. And so he recreated this gate. This gate is also recreated, portion of this gate is recreated in, I think it's the British Museum in London. Maybe part of it is recreated someplace else as well. But they dug it up, was able to figure out what the colors of it was, and and it's gorgeous. Can be seen for a long distance off, and it's a magnificent thing. And so, you know, people went in and out of the city through this gate every day. Can you imagine the beauty that he made certain that his people could see? There's some artist renditions of the city, if I can get to it. This is one artist rendition of what the Ishtar Gate looked like on the walls. Here's one artist rendition of the city, where the Euphrates actually run through the center of the city and had a moat all the way around the city. You'll notice the double walls. It's hard to see them, but there's double walls going all the way around them, around the outside of the city. Only a single wall next to the river, but double walls all the way around the outside. This is the king's. I don't know if this is the king's palace or this is the king's palace. That part I can't tell you. But temples, this was the main temple in the center. But you'll see there's gardens laid out, different places around the city. It was a gorgeous city. Again, this is just an artist's rendition of what they believed it most likely looked like. But I've seen several of these that look almost exactly the same. He spent a lot of time, a lot of work to take care of his people. So I have a hard time when somebody talks to me about him being, you know, a brute. There were things about him. He had a temper. He didn't do some things that were right, but he cared about his people. You can see it. You can see it in the artistry. You can see it in the city and all the things that he built. He was trying to take care of a people, and he had some good things going for him. He had a lot of bad things going for him too, but.
Wonder how, you know, he separated the strong and the mathematical and the scientific and the engineer. I mean, he may have put him to work. Said,
yeah,
I want you to do. I want you to build me a city. There's some engineering wonders that took place in the city. I mean, they knew what they were doing. If you look over the years at all of the pyramids that rose not only in Egypt but throughout the world, ancient men knew a lot more than what we give them credit for, or what most people give them credit for. Okay. All right. Evil Merodach, son of Nebuchadnezzar, came up after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and I forgot what the length of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was. I meant to figure that out. It was either 37 or 56 year reign. I think it was 56, but I can't remember now. Evil Merodach was the next one to reign, and then he brought Jehoiachin out of prison. If you read 2 Kings 25, 27 through 30. Now this is fairly significant because the Israelites at the time would see Jehoiachin as the king of Israel. So Merodach bringing him up out of prison and treating him kindly was a significant act to all Jews. You know, if we were in captivity, or if we had our president and he was in prison in a foreign country, and we saw that foreign leader take him up out of prison and treat him kindly, we would think well of that individual. And so that's exactly what's happened here. And so this is not something to gloss over. This is something to really think about. He is showing kindness to all Jews by raising up this one man.
Okay, then it gets real squirrely after this, as far as the kingdom is concerned. You'll see Neriglisser, he's the brother-in-law to Evil Merodach. He kills Evil Merodach to gain the throne, and then Labashi Marduk, he's the infant son. He's put on the throne after Neriglisser, and he dies mysteriously, which generally means he was murdered. I don't know that for sure, but that's generally what that means. He dies mysteriously. I mean, in the records, he's dead. And particularly since the next thing happens. You'll notice that all of these people in this line are Chaldean. See, notice I have the header up here. It says Chaldean kings. And down here, what do we have to happen? It switches to a Babylonian. Okay, the Babylonian tribe and the Chaldean tribe have always kind of warred with each other a little bit. All right, they didn't get along. There's always friction there. Always has been friction. And so now we have a Babylonian king, Nabonidus. It's suggested by some that he marries the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar in order to get the throne. So there's subterfuge, there's a lot of other things going on, so that's also the indication why the infant died mysteriously. There's just a lot of subterfuge going on in the kingdom, and so it doesn't go well. Now, Nabonidus is one of these individuals that likes strange gods in the Chaldeans' viewpoint. And he gets to a point where the whole kingdom's in an uproar because he's liking to worship foreign gods and strange gods and trying to change the worship of things and doing everything different. And it gets so bad that he leaves the kingdom and he goes off doing other stuff outside the kingdom to raise money and to do his foreign stuff outside of the kingdom. And what does he do? Leaves Junior on the throne. Well, Babylon, it's impregnable. Nebuchadnezzar made this city just impregnable. I mean, we got nothing to worry about. Yeah, we've heard about those Persians and the Medes off, and but they're not going to come down and bother us. And we know the rest of that story, right? Like Paul Harvey says, and we know the rest of the story, right? So Belshazzar is co-regent with his father Nabonidus, but Nabonidus is out of town, shall we say, when that happens. So we'll go down here. We'll look at the last couple of minutes here. Let's look at these maps so we get a good idea of what we're talking about as far as the area that Nebuchadnezzar reigned over. Now you'll see this is the Arabian Desert. Who lives out here? Now, actually, there are some nomads that actually can survive that, but it ain't you and me. Trust me on that. You and I won't last half a day out there. I'm serious about half a day. You and I will burn up and die. We won't make it to evening. It is nasty in the Arabian Desert. It gets 130 degrees during the day, and it gets below zero. Below freezing at night. We're talking extreme temperatures. It goes back and forth. This part of the world will kill you. It's like the Sahara Desert. It's bad there, but there are some people that make a living there. But they're nomads, but generally nobody goes across that area of the world. Civilized people just don't go across there. They just don't. Even the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, they didn't march an army across there because they weren't going to make it. So they went across this area up here. What do we call this area here? Does anyone know? There's a particular name for this area right here. That is correct. It is called the Fertile Crescent. And the reason it's called the Fertile Crescent is because this area is very fertile. That land is very fertile. All of this area up here is mountainous. It's mountainous from this area here all the way down here and all the way down. That thing won't go any further. What happened? All the way down in here where we can't see on this map. Okay? And you'll see down this, on this map here, you'll see that it shows the topography of just a little bit. You see that this is all mountainous. Okay? So when the snow melts in this area, in that region, it brings it down into the Euphrates and then, of course, down in here into the Tigris rivers. And so that area is not only fertile because it brings all that fertile ground down from the mountains, but it also brings the water. And so this area all the way through here and through here is called the Fertile Crescent. The problem that happens down in here is they did so much irrigation. Well, the problem with the type of irrigation they did is they did evaporative irrigation. And what happens when you let water evaporate? It leaves salts. And so what eventually happened down in this region down in here is the ground ended up dying because it built up so much salt in the soil because they let the water evaporate rather than let the water run through and then back down into the river and then into the ocean. But they didn't know that at the time. And so a lot of this land down in here now is dead land because of that. Because they did so much irrigation at the time and allowed it to evaporate, let that water evaporate. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm talking about Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar had control of, and I'm saying control of, all the way down into Egypt. This is the area that we would call Syria, and all the way through Babylon here and down into this area here, which they called Elam, almost to the edge of what we would call Persia at that time. Persia is actually this mountainous region and further down here. You can see Susa, which would be the capital of Persia at one time. If we come back up to this one, it's a little bit larger. We'll see Egypt come up here. He had control of this. And you'll see some of the areas that we see in the New Testament. Lydia. I know that I always wondered where Lydia was when we read that in Acts chapter 2. Where's Lydia? Well, now I know. The things you learn when you start reading your Old Testament a lot. Start studying a little bit. Okay? All right, any questions about any of that? And my time is up. So next week we will start chapter 4 and talk about another dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you very much for your kind attention.